Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'd also, before I begin, like to record my thanks to the Bodleian Library for coming to the rescue of the Watsons manuscript. At a nail-biting auction in Sotheby's in July last year, the Bodleian, as Wilma said, with generous help from the Heritage Memorial Fund, from the Friends of the Bodleian, from Jane Austen's House Museum, and other generous benefactors, literally saved this precious manuscript for the nation. It was in private ownership and would undoubtedly have left the country without the Bodleian intervention, left the country and probably gone into further private ownership elsewhere and perhaps never been seen again. Since its acquisition of the manuscript, the library has exhibited it almost continuously, honouring visibly and imaginatively its pledge to secure it for all of us. So I'd like to record my great thanks to the Bodleian Library for that. And today's celebration is obviously the culmination of that. So today we're celebrating World Book Day here in the Bodleian Library, not with a book, but with a manuscript composed of a collection of small homemade books or booklets, 8 to be exact, of 8 pages each, filled to their very edges with writing and rewriting. In 3 places, the writing spills over, and I'm going to show you images. There's a passage that's heavily deleted, and there are several passages of this kind throughout the manuscript. And what Jane Austen does is, having heavily deleted a passage, she then adds a patch. That is a patch that goes over that passage. I know you can't read it, and I must apologise for that, but at least you can see something. So there's the patch that goes over it. And you can see at the top where she secured it with a pin. I hope you can all see that, can you? And there's the pin. There were 3 of these pins, and we have only 1 of them left, but she patched her manuscript with steel pins that she used to patch her clothes. She was a great one for making do and mend with her clothes and with her manuscripts. And I just wanted you to be able to see that. So, as I said, in 3 places, the writing spills over from the manuscript pages onto these separate leaves, which bear the marks of having been patched onto the booklets and held in place with dressmakers' straight steel pins. This manuscript is a prototype, an early draft, a work in progress, with its first and second thoughts, its deletions and revisions all on display. We literally see it growing from page to page, from patch to patch, from small booklet to small booklet, beneath the writer's hand. A narrative of around 17,500 words, which is about 1/6 of the length of a completed Jane Austen novel. It appears to progress with confidence until it breaks off unfinished. It has no title, no chapter divisions, and no pagination, no page numbers, though each booklet is numbered in the top right-hand corner, and you might just be able to make that out in the top right-hand corner there, which is a number 4, in fact. It may look a bit like a 2, but it's number 4. So no title, no chapter divisions, no pagination. We call it The Watsons after Jane Austen's nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, who gave it that descriptive title in 1871 from the name of the manuscript's central family, and as he put it, for the sake of having a title by which to designate it. The Watsons is special in many ways. First of all, it represents the earliest surviving draft of a novel by Jane Austen in process of development. It's also, incidentally, one of the earliest working, that is, draft manuscripts of any fiction writer in English. I've borrowed my title, Jane Austen Practicing, from Virginia Woolf, one of Austen's most perceptive critics. Woolf used the phrase in her review of Love and Friendship, a volume by which G.K. Chesterton first introduced Austen's teenage writings to the world in 1922. Jane Austen practicing encapsulated for Woolf the experimental spirit of these apprentice early writings, with their exuberant dedication to learning how fiction works. Gleeful parodies, the teenage sketches discover their own voice by mimicking the voices of major published writers of the time, of Fielding, Richardson, Goldsmith, Sheridan and Sterne, and the rolling periods and antithetical syntax of Jane Austen's favourite, Dr. Johnson. And you'll also see in the exhibition, if you haven't already, that we have one of the volumes of her juvenile writings on display too. It's called Volume the First. In these teenage writings, Austen takes the fictions of other writers and turns them into her own fictions. But in the Watsons, by contrast, we encounter another kind of practicing with naturalistic ingredients and the turnstile between art and life. The Watsons is an experiment in turning fiction into life, life into fiction. So it's a completely different kind of experiment, and it marks a decisive change in Jane Austen's way of working. The Watsons was probably written in Bath in 1804-5, when Jane Austen was 28 or 29. I'm moving the wrong way. You can't really see that, but I was hoping you could. There is the 1803 watermark on the paper. And that's one of the ways we can date the manuscript. This makes it her fourth novel, after the fully drafted, though unrevised and unpublished First Impressions, which was later published as Pride and Prejudice, and the fully drafted and again unpublished Sense and Sensibility, and after Susan, which she had sold for £10 as recently as 1803 to the popular firm of Crosby & Co. Crosby & Co. were pulp fiction publishers, and this was the first manuscript she sold to Crosby & Co. Crosby bought it for £10, but asserted his right not to publish. Once a publisher owns a manuscript, if you don't have a contract saying I'll publish, he doesn't have to. So he sat on it. And she bought it back much later, perhaps as late as 1816, and it was only finally published after her death in 1817 under the title of Northanger Abbey. But in 1804, this was an unknown future, and we can assume that the recent successful sale of Susan, of her first manuscript, gave Jane Austen the confidence to begin another, The Watsons. The Watsons tells the story of 19-year-old Emma Watson, adopted in childhood by a rich aunt and uncle, and now following the death of her uncle and her aunt's imprudent remarriage to a much younger man, returned after an absence, we're told, of 14 years to her birth family. This family consists of an invalid clergyman father and 3 unmarried older sisters, living in genteel poverty in their country rectory. 2 brothers, one an apprentice surgeon, the other a lawyer who's been shrewd enough to marry his employer's daughter, are making their way in the world. The character list is full of possibilities. We have a spirited heroine in Emma, the disappointed heiress and stranger in her own family. We have her peevish sisters, sharpened by anxiety, aware of the years slipping by and increasingly desperate to marry well or even to marry at all. Their triumphant sister-in-law, Mrs. Robert Watson, with her superior airs, fresh from the smart set of Croydon. She's always telling us how people do things so much better in Croydon. And Tom Musgrave, the socially affected local eligible bachelor, whom all the sisters have had a crack at. The novel opens onto classic Austen territory as Emma Watson prepares for her first ball. And that's the opening page of the manuscript. She's preparing for her first ball at the nearby assembly rooms in company with her friends, the Edwardses. And these are its opening lines. You won't be able to read them, but I'm reading what's on the screen. The first winter assembly in the town of D in Surrey was to be held on Tuesday, October the 13th, and it was generally expected to be a very good one. A long list of country families was confidently run over as sure of attending, and sanguine hopes were entertained that the Osbornes themselves would be there. The Edwards' invitation to the Watsons followed, of course. The Edwards were people of fortune who lived in the town and kept their coach. The Watsons inhabited a village about 3 miles distance, were poor and had no close carriage. And ever since there had been balls in the place, the former were accustomed to invite the latter to dress, dine and sleep at their house on every monthly return throughout the winter. At the ball, Emma attracts the attention of 2 potential suitors. The Darcy-like Lord Osborne, who is described as, and this is her description of him, a very fine young man, but there was an air of coldness, of carelessness, even of awkwardness about him, which seemed to speak him out of his element in a ballroom. He was not fond of women's company, and he never danced. You recognise him, I think. And Mr. Howard, an agreeable-looking man, a little more than 30, a clergyman. In the Watsons, we seem to have echoes or anticipations of several novels, a general similarity to the economic pressures on the Watson girls and the Bennet girls of Pride and Prejudice, a family likeness between Lord Osborne and Mr. Darcy, and between Mr. Howard and Austen's tutor-like lovers, from Henry Tilney to Edmund Bertram and Mr. Knightley. Emma Watson herself is a study in reverse, in Emma's case, riches to rags, of the kind to be developed more fully in Fanny Price in Mansfield Park. Both are outsiders within their unhappy families. Both seek solace in books. Emma Watson anticipates heroines like Fanny Price and Anne Elliot, whose inner growth are identified with a search for belonging. They're looking for a home. They want to fit. So The Watsons is not only our earliest surviving draft of a work in process of development by Jane Austen, it's a repository of classic Austen ingredients. It also marks a shift in Austen's way of writing. Its central character, Emma Watson, points to the greater introspection and the tougher realism about women's lot that we associate with the mature novels, with Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. But it's barely begun before it is abandoned. The characters are introduced, there is a ball, followed by the unwelcome intrusion of Lord Osborne and Tom Musgrave on the Watsons' meagre family dinner. That too followed by the arrival of the vulgar Mr. and Mrs. Robert Watson on a short visit from Croydon. Just enough story to point up Emma's discomfort in her surroundings and to hint at the courtship plot. And the story ends with Emma rejecting an invitation to go back to Croydon with her brother and his wife, and with their departure. Its final words, that's the final page of the Watsons, and the final words, and the visitors departed without her, which some of you might just be able to make out. Balls are the active agent, the yeast in all Austen's novels. They move the plot along with their opportunities for observing and animating relations between the sexes. Every novel, with the exception of the Sanditon fragment, the novel she left unfinished at her death, every novel has a ball, or in the case of Persuasion, an informal dance. It's given to another Emma, Emma Woodhouse, eagerly clinging to the possibility of holding a ball in the Crown Inn at Highbury, to voice words that sum up the situation for every Austen heroine. What could be worse, says Emma, than dancing without space to turn in? Emma Woodhouse's words speak to a general confinement and absence of opportunity for Austen's heroines, who scarcely ever have space to turn in, and for whom the prospect of dancing at a ball is a precious, fleeting happiness. With this in mind, it's fascinating to see that the ball in the Watsons is the most minutely described in any Austen novel. 20 pages, almost a quarter of the manuscript, are taken up with the ball itself, and several more with its anticipation and its aftermath. There's more detail, more enjoyment in the ball, more ball altogether than we sense the plot needs. There are the preparations for the ball, the dressing and hair arranging, the sharing of girlish confidences and hopes for the evening, what the narrator sums up as the happy occupation, the first bliss of a ball. There's the impatient clock watching and slow pace of dinner, the extra dish of tea and the additional muffin, those are Jane Austen's words, an additional muffin, to fortify them for the long night's dancing. And finally, the ball itself, the shame of too early arrival, of perhaps being the first to be there, the cold of the assembly rooms and those awkward conversations before the dancing begins. Then the little excitements of seeing and being seen, of eyeing and being eyed. And there's a difference between seeing and eyeing, and Jane Austen brings this out very well. The anxiety over partners, will anyone ask me to dance? And then the thrill of dancing at last, the cramped card tables and the refreshments. Then home to analyse every dance and every glance over a welcome bowl of soup. And finally, we're told, Emma went to bed in charming spirits, her head full of Osbornes, Blakes, and Howards. Would Emma Watson's ball have become, in revision, more tightly subordinated to the plot? Would its detail have been pruned? And if so, which detail might have been lost? The question invites us to consider the difference between a manuscript and a printed novel. Until it leaves the writer's laboratory, and remember this never left the writer's laboratory, no part of a manuscript is invulnerable to change. Jane Austen, we know, was a great reviser, each novel a reimagining of the themes and preoccupations of the last. What's fascinating about the ball in the Watsons is its excess of observation, an excess that belongs as much to the noticing eye of the narrator as to the characters in the story. It is as if fiction is not yet fully ascendant. In its excess and its seeming independence of structural purpose, the detail of the ball stands both inside and outside the story, as if it belongs as much to Jane Austen's memories of balls at the Angel Inn at Basingstoke, now some 10 years in her past, as to Emma Watson's ball in the town of Dee in Surrey. Manuscripts, unlike printed books, can't shed easily their personal associations. They're touched by life, quite literally. They bear the imprint of the author's hand. Austen's quirks of spelling, how she formed her letters, how she filled her page, all clues to how she worked and therefore to who she was. A working manuscript is like an author's fingerprint or DNA. It's a unique insight, something that the printed novel effaces. In the case of the Watsons, this collusion between life and art is intensified, which is another reason for this manuscript's special appeal. The Watsons seem set apart from Jane Austen's other finished and unfinished writings. Its rawness, an expression of more than artistic frustration. Her sister Cassandra, after Austen's death in 1817, shared with her nieces something of how the story was meant to develop. And she told her nieces, and these are Cassandra's words, Emma Watson's father was soon to die, and Emma to become dependent for a home on her narrow-minded sister-in-law and brother. That's the Croydon set. They're not Cassandra's words, they're mine. She was to decline an offer of marriage from Lord Osborne, and much of the interest of the tale was to arise from Lady Osborne's love for Mr. Howard and his counter-affection for Emma, whom he was finally to marry. Why was the story abandoned? Writing in 1883, Fanny Caroline Lefroy, Jane Austen's great niece, and an important source of information for the first generation of professional non-family biographers, Fanny Caroline had this to say, Somewhere in 1804, Jane Austen began The Watsons, but her father died early in 1805 and it was never finished. The Watsons seemed set to be a study in the harsh realities of dependent women's lives, with little of the romantic illusion we associate with Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. There are 4 Watson sisters, all unmarried, all virtually penniless, their precarious grasp on respectability threatened by an invalid father whose death will deprive them of their home and of all financial security. Elizabeth Watson, the eldest sister, knows that her only hope of escaping destitution or dependence on unwilling relations lies in marriage, and there's nothing romantic in her vision. Her words are amongst the most moving in the manuscript. I can find them. This is Elizabeth Watson's words, talking to her younger sister. Elizabeth's about 30, and her hopes of marriage are fading. "You know, we must marry. I could do very well single for my own part. A little company and a pleasant ball now and then would be enough for me, if one could be young forever. But my father cannot provide for us, and it is very bad to grow old and be poor and laughed at. I have lost Purvis, it is true, the love of her life, but very few people marry their first loves. I should not refuse a man because he was not Purvis." That sentence really gets to me. I should not refuse a man because he was not Purvis. In a manuscript filled with deletions and interlinear additions, with evidence of second thoughts, it's worth remarking, and you can all see it, I think, from here, that this passage flows easily with almost no correction. Before Jane Austen brought her new novel to the domestic crisis that Mr. Watson's death would precipitate, real events overtook fiction, and her own father, George Austen, died suddenly after a short illness in January 1805. Within 2 months, the Austen women, 2 aging unmarried daughters and their mother, had to give up their house in Bath and moved into cheaper lodgings. From this point to the ends of their lives, they would be dependent for house and security on Jane's brother's generosity. In 1804-5, a new novel based in the harsh circumstances of women's material lives came unexpectedly close to events in Austen's own life. The Watsons, a story of dispossession, may have begun, perhaps almost unconsciously, as Jane Austen's attempt to assert through her art her power over her own circumstances. She was in her late 20s, with the rejection of marriage and the security that represented recently behind her. That story is well known. In December 1802, a family friend in very comfortable circumstances had proposed to Jane and been turned down. Immediately afterwards, or so it seems, she revised Susan, sold it, and began The Watsons. The dark social criticism of The Watsons marked a stage in Austen's maturing as a novelist that must have required her to delve deeper into herself than she had ever done before. Did it remain unfinished because with her father's death, life had pushed the experiment too far? There is finally another possibility, that The Watsons simply ran out of fictional steam, that despite Cassandra's sharing of the intended story, it had no real growth left in it. Is Emma Watson too healthy, unlike, say, Fanny Price of Mansfield Park, too faultless, unlike Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse, and too young and confident, unlike Anne Elliot, to merit deeper acquaintance? Emma is not described until she stands up to dance at the ball, quite a way through the story. Emma Watson, and this is the narrator's description, Emma Watson was not more than of the middle height, well-made and plump, with an air of healthy vigour, Her skin was very brown, but clear, smooth, and glowing, which with a lively eye, a sweet smile, and an open countenance, gave beauty to attract and expression to make that beauty improve on acquaintance. In her short history, she appears to rise too easily above the obstacles life throws at her. This itself is Emma Watson not interesting enough to carry a full-length story. This itself seems to me to raise a third possibility, and with this I'll finish. Is The Watsons, in fact, not a novel at all, but a novella or a long short story? Look at the manuscript before you leave if you get the chance, and you will see there are no chapter divisions. It's written continuously. There's a short rule drawn across the page midway through booklet 7, which suggests a division of the story at this point. And there's another short rule midway through booklet 10, but nothing more formal or structurally marked. If we think of it as a novella, our expectations change. A ball and its consequences become an appropriate study in and for themselves. Perhaps it really is a short story, or a long short story, a novella, centered around a ball. The Watsons is a puzzle among Jane Austen's works, and all the richer for being so. It shouldn't surprise us that a brief and insignificant-looking manuscript should be so full. Austen's art is famously frugal. These densely filled and patched small pages physically demonstrate that rich and mysterious frugality.